Hello everyone, and welcome back to our online edition of Fixing the Future, in which we are traveling every week to meet experts from around the globe in order to try to understand where the future of education is going. Last week we were in Ahmedabad with Kiran Birsetti, and today we are traveling to New York to meet the revolutionary Anne Cook. Anne is co-founder and the executive director of the New York Performance Standards Consortium, an organization which developed an alternative nationally recognized system of performance assessment. We will go deeper into that. As you know, we are running live in two channels, one in English and the other one simultaneously translated in Catalan. Therefore, check now in which channel you are to be sure that it's the right one for you. And above all, remember that you have the unmissable opportunity to ask your questions to Anne using the chat box. Today's talk will be moderated by Caterina Calsamiglia, who is a career research professor at the Institute for Political Economy and Governance, and she will kindly take care to pass your questions to Anne. So, if we are all ready, let's start. Welcome, Caterina.
Hello. It's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Anne Cook. She's an amazing teacher, leader, activist, even writer, who's changing education in New York and the US and hopefully worldwide. And if you have the opportunity to go and visit one of her schools, you'll see that she's a humble, thoughtful, and persistent person. And so what she does is just a great example to all of us. She started building what is called the Urban Academy School in the Upper East Side of New York City, targeting those kids that most need education, and with the goal of having them become competent and active participants of our society. And very quickly, she realized that one of the great inhibitors in achieving that goal was the permanent testing that the city was making their students do. And so she built what is now called the Standard for Performance Consortium, which is a network of almost 40 schools, public schools, that constructed together an alternative assessment procedure that is now recognized and which has exempted those schools of taking those tests. And this new assessment is basically fueling the learning instead of conditioning and inhibiting the learning and the pedagogical strategies in the schools. Now she's even going beyond that and also making sure that if these kids once they get out of the schools, if they need to go into college, she's also through the Fair Test Initiative, which is a nationwide initiative, also changing what college admissions are taking into account when they admit their students. So she's basically convincing colleges throughout the country to move away from high-stakes exams and look at this alternative performance assessment measures. And so what she's doing is just amazing, is a dream come true to many of us. And so I will just stop here and let Anne talk, who's going to give us a brief introduction. She wanted to make sure there was enough time for all of you to ask questions, and so that the talk would be more inquiry based on what you guys want to listen to, which is just very coherent with who she is. So let me just stop here and let Anne talk. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you for that somewhat accurate introduction. And thanks also to Sylvia for creating this opportunity. And I do hope we can make this very interactive and have questions. So I'm just going to give a very brief kind of overview of how we got where we are, and most of it is actually in an article that Sylvia posted on your website, and many of the things that I'll talk about very briefly, if you're interested. There's a website that we have called www.performanceassessment.org, and a lot of the things that I just touch on, if you're curious about it, you can go to the website and get more information. So just very briefly, a kind of history. This project initiative started in the mid 90s, and we were fortunate in New York State to have a state commissioner by the name of Tom Sobel, who was really one of the great educators in the country at the time. He was very aware of what some schools in New York State were doing, public schools. And he noticed that there were some of us that were using a different way to assess what students were doing. And when we went to him and said, would he be willing to give us a kind of waiver from the tests that were required by the state, he was actually very supportive and said yes, he would. And so he wrote a regulation that allowed us to go on and use a different system of assessment. In New York, students to graduate, to get a diploma that they can use to go on to college, are required to take five exams, and they're supposed to have a score of 60 on all of the exams, at least 65. Otherwise, they are not able to graduate. And we proposed a different way of knowing what they were doing. And I think that over the years, we've had in the United States a very long history of testing, probably 50 years of testing. And it's gotten more and more, I would say, more and more oppressive because there are states that don't allow kids to graduate unless they pass the tests. And what few people realize is that the tests really drive curriculum and instruction. So if you're really interested in kids developing their own ideas and being able to discuss and being able to go into depth on a topic that they're interested in, generally speaking, teachers are very reluctant to do that because they're not going to be able to cover all the material that's on the test. And so this regulation that this commissioner created for us was very important. And down through the years, the testing has gotten more elaborate. We now are required by federal law to test all children, third grade to eighth grade, and in high school in English and math. And so we are exempt from this, and then the states put on additional requirements. So in New York, it's more there are more requirements than just those two exams. So this system that we've developed is very important to our schools. And I think a lot of schools recognize that they would do better if they didn't have to worry about these tests. I want to just say at the outset, I understand you don't have a system like this, but you do use the SAT as a test that was used by many colleges and universities. For instance, if you want to apply to a university, you would normally have to take the SAT. But a few years ago, an organization called Fair Test started to work on this issue and persuaded some colleges to go what they call test optional. That is, to find some other ways of knowing whether they were going to take a student. And now, of course, with COVID, there are no colleges requiring the SAT. And in fact, some major universities, everybody from Yale to the University of Chicago to the city universities to the California universities, are not using the SAT. About 1,200 of them had signed on to not using it. And then when COVID came, that number increased enormously because colleges weren't able to figure out ways of having kids take that test, and the College Board wasn't able to figure it out. And so students are being admitted now without the SAT scores. And we can talk about one of the things we've been doing in New York, if people are interested. So what is this system of assessment that we've developed? First of all, to say a little bit about the schools, these are all public schools. They're all high schools, or some of them are 6 to 12. Most of our high schools in the States are 9 to 12. And we have students who are immigrants who have just been in the country less than 4 years, who don't pass the English proficiency test, and they go to these schools called international schools. So we have some schools like that are part of the consortium. We also have schools in New York that are called transfer schools. These are schools where the student population are kids who've come from other schools. They haven't been happy in those schools, or the school may not have been happy with them. And they come to a transfer school. We have some of those schools. And then we have regular 9 through 12 schools, a very, very diverse population. In general, our kids on the 8th grade test score below the city average as a whole, as an aggregate. And they are representative of the racial and ethnic diversity of the city. And they are, in many cases, below the poverty line. We have many schools in the Bronx and areas of the Bronx which have the highest rate of poverty in the country. So these are low-income kids, many of them. We have a very high percentage in some of the schools of special needs. So this is not an elite population that we've been able to do this work with. So I think that should get everybody pause, that it's not creaming kids to only find students who can handle this work. What is the work? Well, what is the system? It consists of a number of different components. So we say that the consortium is student-focused, that is, the assessment tasks are student-focused, that they are practitioner and student-directed, and that they are externally assessed. So we have outside people coming in, especially for the oral component. What we feel we've done or tried to do is create opportunities for students to demonstrate what they know and can do. And partly because we feel learning is complex, so assessment should be too. It shouldn't be just a test that they have to get certain answers to or multiple choice. And so the students in our schools graduate using their performance assessments. The components are primarily concerned with the tasks in the junior and senior year, but they have to come from the bottom up. You know, they can't just all of a sudden do the work in their senior year and expect to graduate. So there are required of all students in all of our schools have to do tasks in 4 areas: English, math, social studies, and science. And then schools add on a number of things. There are schools that have an art performance assessment, a language performance assessment. Many of the schools have internships that are required. In order to know whether students have accomplished what we think is passing, we have what are called rubrics, and those are used across the same rubrics that are rubrics for all the schools. And the work that gets looked at through the lens of the rubrics is work that grows out of classrooms. So teachers would be teaching courses in their junior and senior year in particular, and students would say, "Oh, I really am interested in this," or they'd write a paper, and the teachers would say, "This could be developed into one of your proficiencies, one of your performance assessments." So we have rubrics that are used, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Culture of revision that develops in the schools, that's very much a part of the system. That is, kids can rewrite. They write a lot, and we hope we provide a lot of feedback on their writing and their math, all of their subjects. There's also an oral component when they come to the point where their papers are ready to be submitted. After they've done that, there's an oral component in which they have to really defend their work. And there are outside assessors who come in to listen to that and to ask them questions. that to us is an extremely important part of the process. In order to obviously do this work, you need a lot of professional development. So we have a very extensive professional development that includes some things that are very formal, like a moderation study in which we collect papers from across the consortium. We have on a given day 150, 200 teachers coming together. We give them the papers that have been graded by the schools and the people that the schools have pulled in to look at the work. And they're regraded with no identifying identifiers on it, no names, no school names, and they are regraded. And then we are looking for reliability. You know, is the school applying the rubrics in a way that a team of teachers looking at the work who didn't know the student would agree. So these are we do this twice a year. We also do it in the schools. We have moderation studies that go on in the schools, and we also send the papers to people that we are involved with at the college level, the university level, and they have their education students regrade the papers. So we're constantly looking to see whether our expectations in the schools match up with what the expectations are when we apply the rubrics. I might say about the rubrics, they're not fixed in stone. Teachers are very much part of this process, and every year or two, we will go back and revisit the rubrics in each of the areas. And so we have, there are rubrics in math, science, there are 2 in science, English, and social studies. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the social studies, for example, if we were to look at one of them, you can see these, actually you'll see them if you go on to the website. But if you look at the social studies, one of the defining features of the rubrics is they are not content driven. In other words, when students are taking all kinds of courses, we're not really interested in, does the student know, say, for example, about the War of 1812. What we're interested in is, does the social studies paper meet certain criteria of what it means to do a paper, let's say an historical analysis. So just to give you what the categories are that we're looking for, students would, if they were going to get an outstanding, they would have to meet a very high bar. Does the paper carry with it a thesis, a viewpoint, a claim that's sharply defined, that's compelling, that's concise? Does it have evidence and sources? And are those evidence and sources, do they support the argument that the student's making? Are they relevant? Are they accurate? Are they verifiable? And are they drawn from both primary and secondary sources? And then the rubrics would look for in the paper for the student's ability around analysis and persuasion. Are the arguments coherent? Is it complex? Is it sophisticated? Does it support the thesis? And looking at multiple interpretations. And does it have an effective organization, the paper? Does it have an understanding of the implications of the content? Are the students aware of historical or cultural or political questions that are addressed in the paper? And does it have a student voice? Is the student who wrote it, is he confident? Is he fluent when he's writing it? And does it meet the conventions of grammar and punctuation? And then for the oral, we're interested in whether the student can talk about the subject in a broader way than the paper, understand enough about the surrounding context of the paper, the topic, to demonstrate ownership of the work. So that's just in one area. And if you go onto the website, you can see the rubrics for all of the subjects. So we feel that without having to concern ourselves with the tests, we can refocus on the important things for kids, which is curriculum and instruction. Does it engage kids? And is it interesting and challenging to the teachers? I mean, we want schools to be professional communities, places where teachers can work together. And does it create a culture in the school that allows for a focus on inquiry? And are there discussion-based classrooms? And is there evidence of deeper learning? Does the student voice come through, like this issue of ownership? And is there a focus on cultural relevance? And these are things we're trying to foster in the pedagogy and in the curriculum. So what do we mean by inquiry? It's a long topic, a long story, but just to sort of give you some idea of what we're talking about, we want kids to have opportunities to discuss issues that matter, to understand how you can argue, and we want, I think our feeling is that as you learn, you have to be able to develop your own perspective on things, and take ownership of the material. And does the student struggle to make sense of something that's important? And discussion, of course, is really, I think, at the heart of it. So it's harder work for teachers because it requires a different kind of planning, but we think that the results that we get are much better in terms of preparation for life, preparation for jobs, preparation for university. And, I think this last election in our country, it is evidence that there's not enough of this kind of exploration and opportunity to discuss issues. I don't think that in many areas people shy away from controversy. They shy away from finding out what kids think. And I think that you have, in a democracy, I believe you have to have mechanisms that start in the schools, really, to have opportunities for students to really learn about issues, delve into issues, go deep into certain topics, and not always agree, but to really find ways of assessing whether what their point of view is has evidence to back it up. And I think we have a long way to go in our country to achieve that. So I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to talk about any of the aspects or to go beyond that. And maybe we could start with some questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Anne. So first question I would like to ask is, so you seem to have a very clear picture of what you want students to achieve and how to make that happen. And my first question is, how do you make that a shared goal for all of the teachers in your school? And how important do you think the scaling is? Is it important that other schools also agree on what these important things are, and that there is a common agreement on what different schools are doing?
I think it's a process. We have a lot of teachers who come in to the schools who've been trained in very traditional ways, and I think that they don't understand what this is about, really. And we try in all kinds of different settings to involve them in the discussion. So, for example, and take math is a good example. I mean, I would say that for the most part, math is one of the least well-taught subjects in our schools. And the proof of that, I think, is if you look at the test scores, what you see is that actually, in order to pass, students needed to basically answer 30% of the questions on the test, 30%. And if you ask them afterwards about this stuff, they don't have a clue what it's really all about. Most of the teaching in math is very procedurally oriented, based on procedures. Kids learn procedures. And we've tried to turn that around in a way to really focus on problem solving and having kids grapple with real math problems. Now, how do you do that? Because most teachers are not familiar with that. So we have somebody who's our math coach, And what we've done is, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've put together what we call exchanges. So we have, in each exchange, there are about 3 or 4 schools, and we ask that all the math teachers in a school would be involved in this, so that each of the exchanges would be probably around 20 people. And they meet together, and they go over student work, they go over and they look at different to how you teach math. And it's a very long process. And we now have, I would say, if you came to New York and said, I want to see this, we could actually take you to some classes where this is happening. Now, I think what you'll see is, if you go on the website, there are some films of the oral presentation. And there's a couple of films, and I think there's 2 maybe up there, of students making their oral presentations in math. And I think what you see is sort of the delight. I mean, these are not kids we have kids who had never really had a very good experience with math. I would say, if you ask them what was their least favorite subject and their least successful subject, many, many students would say math. But because they're really engaged in problem solving in different ways, they have learned all kinds of what we would call traditional math, but they've done it in a way that involves them at the heart of it and trying to solve real math problems, some of the problems that the Greeks came up with. Those are some of the kinds of problems kids are looking at. And I think that what you need to do is to get a few teachers together, talk about how successful they think they are with the students, talk to kids. Is this something that really excites you? Have you taken any courses that really got you excited, that picked up on a passion that you have? And kids will often tell you, well, not really. I mean, you say, well, why are you so compliant? Why don't you walk out of the class? And because they want to go on to college. They want good recommendations. They want to be able to go on to university, or they want to get a better job. Well, is what they're learning going to help them do that? And is the learning that they're doing going to help make them active citizens in a democratic society and participate? Because if they don't participate, I think what we have seen in the States is that you can come very, very close to losing the freedoms that you have. So I think that teachers play the critical role here. And a lot of times teachers teach the way they themselves were taught. And so it's a conversation that starts with, what is it that you think you're trying to do? Is it succeeding? How is it succeeding? In what way? And what do you think kids are getting out of this experience? And then it helps if you have some teachers who've been doing it a while, and you can do a video, or you can take them to those classes, and you can start a conversation. And it is very much a conversation to talk about. I find that teachers like to talk shop. If you get a small group together to really talk about issues, and they can have trust that you're not going to go report them to somebody, and they start to trust each other, I think you'll find that come up with all kinds of ideas of things that they could do differently. So it's not a short process. It takes time.
Yeah, I think something that is super encouraging is to understand that the fact that you cannot do it directly as a teacher. So if you've been teaching always with a different style, but you really believe something, you should be doing things differently, that there's a way of developing into that other teacher that you would like to be. So you've been trained as a teaching to the test, but there's a way for you to shift into becoming an educator, no? And I think it's very encouraging to learn that one becomes that, and that the assessment itself is not only a way to assess students, but it's also a way for you to understand what you want to look for, what are the behaviors that you want to see, what you would like your students to be able to do. And it's a way of reflecting yours to be able to do, and it's a way of reflecting yourself about what you do, and so what you should be able to achieve. And that part of the conversation with the other teachers is what's gonna lead you to say, well, I'm not really achieving what, I'm not getting my students to think deep enough about certain issues. How do I do that? And then you get ideas from other teachers and all of that. So I think it's super interesting to understand that this is not something that just happens magically, that there's a process, that there's a learning process into that, and that it just involves talking and learning from each other and evolving into that. And it's quite impressive that you've managed to, through that procedure, create a common understanding in 39 schools, and where you can all like feed each other from that. I think something that people are wondering about, and that I think you have not mentioned, but I know that you do very well, is a way of providing some external checks. Like you may believe that you're doing what you're doing, but you do have like reality checks, right? You have all these external people who come and look at your students and in a very particular task, and will give you feedback on how they're doing. So I think it would be, people would be very interested in understanding how that happens. It's not a standardized test, but you do have some external people providing you a lot of feedback that is helping you update what you think about your students.
We do use a lot of outside people coming in, and especially in the oral presentations that the students make. So if a student did a paper on an aspect of constitutional law, on that student's oral panel might be a lawyer, an actual lawyer, who would come and talk to the student about their paper and ask them some questions that might not be about the paper itself, but what is the context that this paper was written in. But I want to mention one other thing. When we do these moderation studies where we bring together all these teachers and they're looking at student work and regrading it, we have another exercise which we do always do, which is to ask the teacher to submit a task. What was the task that the student was actually addressing when they wrote their paper? And we didn't always do this, but several years ago, in one of the moderation studies, one of the teachers that was participating said, this is a good incompetent paper. And we said, what? Said, well, the paper follows all the forms. There's kind of, they've done the grammar is okay. They've laid the issue. But the question that the student was asking, that the assignment that this grew out of, it wasn't very challenging. It wasn't very good. So the student kind of answered within the parameters of the topic, that's the subject that they had selected and written about, but it wasn't very challenging. And from that point on, we started to ask teachers to submit the task as well as the paper, as well as and we use now, there's an educator for many years taught at one of the universities by the name of Norman Webb. And he developed a way of looking at assignments that gave you some ideas about the challenge and the sort of level of demand and a challenge for the student. And so now we not only have teachers regrading the papers, but we also have them assessing the task. All of that information that comes out of these moderation studies goes back to the schools and back to the teachers. And so it's an entry point to say, what happened here? This student seems to have some skills, but the sort of topic that the question wasn't very challenging. There wasn't enough there wasn't very much they could do with it. When you're doing inquiry, it makes an assumption. The inquiry teaching assumes that accumulating information is relatively useless unless students can articulate and elaborate their own perspectives on the material. And in order to do that, you have to start to develop a different style of teaching that really opens it up to more student participation and really helps students challenge their points of view. And you're not there to teach them what your point of view is. You're there to help them develop the skills to be able to analyze material and reflect on the information that they're reading about. So I think that teachers learn how to create more interesting, more probing, more in-depth kinds of questions that students can then get involved in. And that's one way that I think it doesn't necessarily have to come from outside, but it kind of, or some activities like the moderation studies that help move it from what teachers are looking at to a broader set of questions.
Now, also things that people are asking. So often for students, also you need to change the mindset because they're also very grade oriented or like standardized assessment oriented. So how do you make them perceive this feedback that you're continuously giving them about how well they're doing on different tasks? How do you make that, you know, a process? Like, how do you make that part of how do you make them perceive this as something that's gonna just help them be what you want them to be, but not a, you know, it's not it's not judging you, it's just indicating to you what are the things you need to improve. So do you work on that? Like, is formative assessment something?
Well,
Excuse
if
me?
you're talking about students, you're talking about the students or the teachers? What
Students.
are you talking about? The student? How do you student? Well, I mean, teachers. It's not as though teachers don't give their own tests. Teachers always, you know, if you're giving an assignment to kids, you want to make sure they've read it. You might give them a test, you know, just at the beginning of class, or you know, you can see in their papers whether they're actually doing the backup work. Are they reading the material? Are they able to use the material? You know. Let me describe one course that we developed that some people teach at the very beginning when kids are freshmen or sophomores. It's called Looking for an Argument. It's got a question mark. It should be Looking for an Argument. And it's a course that in which the teachers would take a topic that they think is really relevant to the kids. They'd put it up on the board. They'd start by putting the question on the board, and they'd ask the kids, there'd be two adults in the room. Sometimes a teacher would get another person to come in and do this first part with them. So it might be, you might want to get into a whole topic about COVID. Let's say you're going to do it's on everybody's mind. What are we going to do with teaching about this pandemic? In the United States, one of the big issues is, should people wear masks? I mean, and it's very complicated because if you want to do that topic, people in this country are ready to first of all, a lot of people don't wear masks. The question is, what should government be able to tell people that they have to wear masks? And if they don't wear masks, what are the consequences for them personally? If the government is telling people to do something, if you run a red light, people know what the consequence is. You get a ticket for driving through a red light. Well, what's the consequence if you don't wear a mask? Should there be consequences at all? And so because this was a big topic that people were exercised about. So two of the teachers decided they wanted to do this with some kids. And this is, by the way, this is on remote, so it's doubly difficult. But what they did was they said to the kids, okay, here are the arguments. So they said, they put it up on the board. Should people wear masks? And teacher A, what do you want? Which side should teacher A argue? So teacher A argued the side that kids said, teacher A should argue for masks. Teacher B should argue against masks. And the teachers argued with each other, debated each other for about 3 minutes each. Then all the kids came into it, and they got involved. And kids were asked to take notes. At the end of the class, the notes were collected. And the teachers picked out a couple of examples that they felt would raise a question about when you take notes, if you have a speaker or when you're listening to a lecturer, what are you taking? Are you writing down every word? Are you taking the main idea? So they picked out a couple of notes that kids had written. They fed them back to the kids. Then there was a discussion about the notes. Then they got a packet of readings from everything across the spectrum. Yes, you should wear masks. No, you should not wear masks. the masks don't help, the masks do help. There's been a ton of very sophisticated writing about how do you deal with COVID, and it involves prevention, and the masks were one of the issues. They read that, they underlined it, they went through it, they tried to figure out what were the main points. And the kids were constantly debating this in the class. At the end of the week, there's a process that they go through. They were asked to write a paper in class on a related topic, not on the one they'd been discussing, but one that was related, you know, so another issue. And those were collected, they were handed back, they were discussed, kids talked about the quality of the papers. Now, if you do a course like that, and every week you're doing a different topic, let's say, by the end of the term, the students will have written 10 or 15 pages, papers on different topics. And you can actually see the progress of the kids' writing and ability to think more critically as the time goes on, because they begin to realize, well, what are these articles that you gave me? What did they argue? How do you work with that? What do you think? Where's your voice? What's the evidence? What's good evidence? What's bad evidence? What's fact? What's fiction? And all of that, over time, you can build a whole body of information about student progress. And you can do that in any subject. I mean, if you have students developing experiments in science, then the first experiment and the write-up of that experiment and their understanding of the scientific method, you can actually see progress over time as kids get practice at doing those things. And I think that's their interim assessments going on all the time. What I was talking about in terms of what we asked for is the graduation level, and the rubrics are for the graduation level work. But the work that you're doing over the course of the term and over the course of the years that you have these students is building towards an understanding and a skill in being able to do the work at the end when you're doing it for graduation. So, and I would say teachers are constantly talking to each other, visiting each other's classes, which I think is critical, and visiting classes of master teachers to see, well, what did it look like in that, and sitting in on oral presentations to see what other students in their subject area are doing in different schools. I mean, I think that, you know, in the same way that doctors learn to be good doctors, it's not by just going to school and then staying in their own little office. You know, a lot of lawyers feel like they want to be part of a firm because they talk to people about the cases that they are doing. And I think in teaching, we've gotten to the point where too much teachers go to school, go to their class, teach their kids, and go home. And I think you need professional communities to have opportunities to really talk through what you're doing.
Thank you. Very many people are wondering how your methods of both assessing and like inducing the learning, how transversal are they? Like they're wondering whether it's applicable to primary school, whether somebody's asking even if this is only happening in rural schools, and this is happening in the very middle of Manhattan, so that's very impressive. And also about adults. So basically, is this something, what you're getting at, is it something that is true in any learning process at any stage, or is it something that is targeted for high school kids? What do you think?
Well, I think the idea of kids taking ownership of material is true all through your education, certainly your formal education. And we have some elementary schools that have been using performance assessment with kids in third and fourth grade. So that's like 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And there are people who are trying to figure out how to make this, you know, if you're when a child moves from the primary school into the junior school, to have an assessment at that point that tells the teachers, is this kid ready for the next level? And I've sat in on some of these with young children, and they're just fantastic. I mean, the oral defense, when the kids will present what they've done, and then they get questioned about it, you see a different side to a lot of students, kids who may be not the best readers in the class, but they have the ability, they really understand what the topic and the subject and the project that they did. It takes them from that to being able to communicate to adults. It's fantastic, I think, and it makes a huge difference to the way in which kids feel about themselves. I mean, think of the difference how a student feels about themselves if they do that and get feedback, as opposed to taking a test that they never, they either pass or they fail. I just think that people like to have comments about their work and how are they going to do a better job, especially if it's something they care about. And I think that a lot of school kids are not engaged with what they're doing. They do it. I mean, in this country, middle-class kids who want to go to university put up with a lot of very boring teaching. And I think if you ask them why they put up with that, they say, well, it's a good grade on my record and then I can go to university. And, but they're not really learning very much. And they're not enjoying it very much. And I want kids to have a curiosity and an interest in what they do. So I want to find ways to be able to really engage them. And I have to say, this mask project really took off. And kids went into neighborhoods and started doing all kinds of surveys about who wore masks, who didn't. Was it determined by your gender, by your age, by your neighborhood, by your income level? What should government do? They had all kinds of ideas about whether government should do anything at all. Somebody said, well, there should be a fine if they don't wear a mask. And so, well, the kids would say, well, the only people that affects are people who don't have a lot of money. If you have a lot of money and you don't wear a mask, say, oh, what the heck, I'll pay the fine. Well, if the fine was like they do in Sweden, it was adjusted to your income, you might feel a little differently about it. And, they had a debate about that. That's a really interesting idea, that if you want to change people's behavior, how do you do that? And how do you make it work in a society? So, and you see the same thing, by the way, in all the subjects. It's not just in these kind of social questions. It works with, I've never seen it not work with a particular group of people. It works with young kids. It works with high school kids. It works in college. I've taught college and we've done this sort of thing. And we've assessed using performance assessment rather than a standardized test. I just want to go back to the SAT for a minute. The SAT was theoretically, it was supposed to be a good indicator of college or university success. High score, you did very well. There is very little evidence of that. Very little. And in fact, we have had a project at City University because we wanted to make sure our kids were going to get into the four-year colleges, and their SAT scores were very low, or were lower. They were low enough so that the colleges wouldn't to put them in the senior colleges. And so we said to them, okay, how about if we give you some work that the student has done, papers, math projects, etc. We give you one of those. We give you a PBAT, what they call a PBAT, a performance assessment paper, and you try it out. And what's happened, and you can see this on the website. It's all there. We track these kids, and they do better than the kids who got in with the high test scores, because they have a different ethic about working. To them, when you're reading something, you're trying to be analytic about it. You're not just reading it to give answers to a particular question.
So you would say that in order to make this, to incorporate new colleges wanting to do that, you would start small by convincing a few universities to try it out and then use that evidence to convince others, so that this, because wanting to change the system seems like a big.
Well, I think the real issue is, would universities in general take students who don't come in with the test scores? would they take them on the basis of performance assessment? And actually, we've been around, the consortium has been around since 1998. And in all those years, we've gotten students into all kinds of colleges. The reason why we started this pilot project with the City University was because it was the only institution that was not accepting our kids. And they were kind of not accepting kids because all they were looking at was the SAT score. And so there are a lot of colleges that don't use, there are 1,200 colleges that don't use the SAT scores anymore. They call them test optional schools. And they're the way they're looking at kids differently. They're looking, and now City University, which has to go through thousands of applications, and the University of California, they are not using the test scores from the SATs anymore. So in New York, the City University is now looking at student work. And I think that's really what we're talking about. Look at the work that the students can produce and see what that tells you. And then that'll tell you whether students really have the capacity to do college and university level work, not the SAT. SATs in this country, anyway, are really related to zip code, postal code, where you live, how much money your family makes, can your family afford a tutor, can your family afford a class that you can take. If you take a class, as my own children did, your scores can go up by as much as 100 points. Well, what is that? What does that got to do with whether you have whether you're a good writer, or whether you can put your ideas down, whether you can defend your ideas, whether you have a curiosity? It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with, I have one child out of three. I have three kids. One child could have taken the test with her eyes closed. She always did well on standardized tests. The other two did okay, but they weren't as good as she was. But it didn't tell me anything about her as a student. There were other things that would tell me much more.
So, some other people are wondering about, how is there any dimension in which your way of assessing becomes standard in some sense? So, or is it systematically personalized? How much sharing is there of ways of assessing? And is there like a backlog where you have, ways of assessing, ideas for challenges or things to be done in the classroom for people, and how to assess those? How much reuse of a given strategy is there in the network of schools that you're leading?
Quite a lot. There's a tremendous amount of sharing. A lot of sharing of somebody will get an idea or try a different way of doing a course or a subject. The rubrics, I want to say, are standardized across so even in the middle class schools, the same rubrics are used as the schools in the South Bronx. When they're looking at papers, when they're looking at student work, the same rubrics are what we use. They're not changed according to the income level or the education level of the parents. It has nothing to do with it. They're the rubrics that are used throughout the consortium. The expectation is, in order for students to graduate, they have to have a distribution of courses. So they need 44 credits, and that's true no matter what high school or school you go to across the state. So that's standardized. We don't have anything to do with that. That's the way the state, we would like the state to include more, to give more credit to kids who do internships, for example, career to work experiences. We would like for that to factor into the diploma more than it does, because actually I think kids get a tremendous amount out of going outside of school and doing some work in all kinds of different settings. And I think schools should get credit for arranging those things, and the kids should get credit for doing them and you can assess it as well. We do that as well. So there are certain standard things that they do, but the content of what goes on in the specific course is not the same necessarily. You might have it tends to be, teachers in these schools tend to do things more in depth. So they might spend a whole semester looking at the history of the civil rights movement in America, a whole semester. Now, in most schools, that would maybe be at the most a few days, because you'd be using a textbook that would be a survey course. And we don't do that. We don't teach. We teach depth rather than coverage. And the reason for that is, if you go and talk to university faculty, they'll say, you know, they're much more interested in whether students have an understanding of how you approach. If you don't know the information, how do you find the information? How do you assess the information? So if you talk to the sort of leading figures at Columbia, which we do quite often, say, well, what are you looking for in a freshman and a first-year university student? They want someone who knows how to find sources, assess the sources, assess whether the sources have credibility. Can they tell fact from fiction? Do they know how to write? Do they know how to put their ideas down on paper? Do they know how to take an idea and explain the idea and then explain it from different points of view, multiple perspectives? That's what's important to people at a university. Do they know in literature? Do they know how to read critically?
Okay, and then last question, is there hope that we can educate those who have not had the luxury of going through your education system? So can we educate 30, 40, 50 years old? Is there a space for that? Do you see, you know, is there hope that we will all finally learn those skills? Because I think many of us are still missing them.
Well, you know, I don't know. I sort of hope so, because we've got an American electorate that certainly needs to, a lot of, you know, 62% of the people who voted for 62% of the college educated males, white males, voted for Trump. And if you talk to them, they have reasons why they did, which I personally think they needed to be more, they need to be in a situation where they're being challenged more. But, you know, I would say this about the teachers, that we have teachers who come into our schools who haven't taught this way and who choose to come to these schools. And these are teachers who are career teachers. So the retention rates at our schools is much better than the retention rate at test-driven schools. I think people like to teach in these environments because there's a lot more give and take, a lot more sharing, a lot more visiting each other's classes. And it certainly takes a while, but if you work at it, it happens more than it doesn't. So yes, I would say there is hope, but you just have to keep at it. And try to link up with examples in, you know, that show that if we don't do it, we're going to be in some serious trouble. We have to get people to think hard about things that affect them and make sense of this world. We've got a climate crisis. That's universal. What are we doing to educate people about that, about what to do?
Right. You know, I was just thinking that given that you've taken all these challenges, maybe your next challenge can be how do we get adults educated when we're still not? Just kidding slightly. But I do think that if somebody can do it, it would be you. So anyway, so I think our time is up. Is that right? I think it's 7 o'clock and we're supposed to, there's still some questions. No? Okay. But so they're in the chat, and but I guess I've tried to do my best to keep wrapping them up into different questions. But everybody is thrilled. Everybody's enthusiastic about what you've been talking about, and we all wish we had more time to listen more. And I think something that we all would like to see more is how do you actually do it, no? Because it sounds beautiful, and I think we could just learn a lot from seeing it and being there and sharing all these teachers whose learning experiences, how they interact with each other, because this is something that happens so little in most schools, no? That teachers learn from each other, and that we keep questioning whether we are achieving what we want to achieve, and what role is assessment playing in achieving those goals, instead of having assessment be the goal. So thank you very, very, very much. And I hope we have more chances of continuing the conversation, because this is just too wonderful. Thank you, Anne.
And thank you for all the questions.
Thank you, Caterina. Thank you, Anne, for this amazingly interesting debate. So we have to unfortunately leave it here. We're running out of time. But if you're eager for more, next week we will be here again to welcome Mansetta Marope, former director of UNESCO's International Bureau of Education. So thank you everybody for following us, for your questions. See you all next Thursday, and let's keep fixing the future.